Thank you so much for joining again. This is our visual regression webinar talking about automatically checking for visual regressions. Thank you so much for joining. We probably will not take the full hour to go through material. We definitely encourage questions. Chat should be enabled, so feel free to drop us a chat. You can send it to panelists if you just want to ask a question, or you can send it to everyone, no problem. But let's go ahead and get started. So I'm Noshnika Malafera, or just Nika, if you find Noshnika hard to say. As a guidance, the Hashek is pronounced like the CH in chocolate, sort of a breathy. Anyway, you probably see me right on the news stack. You may know me from Serverless Mom on Twitter. You can see me over the CNCF stack. I have been working in observability for a bunch of years, for 7, 8 years. I'm new to the Checkly team. I've been with the Checkly team for a few months. So when I want the real expert on the Checkly product or the Checkly story, I, of course, talk to Tim.
Hey folks, I'm Tim. I'm one of the founders at Checkly, and I've been working in this sector. Oh man, feels like eternity. I guess since I was 18, 19, so more than 20 years ago. I'm now chief evangelist at Checkly, which means I speak to you folks about what we're doing and trying to pull synthetic monitoring into the new age. If you want to check me out on Twitter, sorry, X, it's just my name with an underscore in between. Back to you, Nika.
And you know, but both of us from having done this a long time, do you remember the time when, and you'll hear me mention it maybe once or twice else throughout this, that back in the day, synthetic monitoring or pinger monitoring, or whatever you might call it, was really just going and looking for a 200 on a page. And I mention that because there is this unification that a tool like Checkly sits at between what we might think of as a test and monitoring. When you go look up playwright.dev, which is our framework that we use for simulating user behavior and running these monitors on a page, you'll see testing is all over there. And you'll think about this stuff as testing is what they'll refer to. Like, oh, this is the tool to like run right after a deploy to say, hey, is this stuff working correctly? Well, maybe you're running Playwright against staging before deployment, but something like a visual regression test would be something you think about running right after a deployment. By the way, Tim, your video appears to be frozen. I'm just getting one frame, so I don't know if that's intentional or there we are. We're back.
We're back.
Yay! All right.
It's my Sony health bar. It's I don't know why it does that.
But you know, so when we talk about doing something like comparing pixel by pixel an interface on your main site and saying, okay, has anything changed? That is normally something we think of like just running. Hey, we did a deploy. Does everything look right? Cool, we're good to go. We just run that once. But at Checkly, we're talking about using that as a monitor, running that continually, and saying even if it's every 24 hours, but maybe in every minute, right? Checking for those changes. And you've been working in this space a long time. How do you kind of explain that? Not dichotomy, but that kind of union of these two concepts.
That's a good one, Nika. And luckily, we rehearsed that. So what we're trying to do at Checkly, and very specifically with Playwright, is kind of blurring the lines between end-to-end testing and monitoring, which you kind of mentioned already, while still taking into account that they are essentially separate things. Very specifically, they are separate business processes with our customers. You can imagine that when a test fails, maybe that's not the right moment to wake someone up in the middle of the night and let their pager go off, or maybe mobile phone right now. So we are well aware that they are separate, but we're using the same tooling, we're using the same concepts, and very specifically, Playwright lends itself extremely well for doing essentially end-to-end testing on a loop, which then turns into monitoring.
Yeah. And again, right from the start, even when there were very simple checks happening on a cadence on a site, people were always asking to go a little further, right? To hey, don't just look for this text on a page. Let's go ahead and try to do a login. Is there some way I can do a login with this very, very simple machine that's doing this? And of course, Playwright takes us all the way there and further. This is one of the code snippets that you'll see in the presentation. I promise you neither have to remember this exact code or parse it perfectly. If you're getting it as you look at it, fantastic. It's just really here for an example. In this case, right, we're looking at some of the stuff that Playwright can simulate very, very readily, right? So it goes a lot beyond kind of a traditional system where you have like locators go find something on a page and check its text. You can do things like checking things for role, clicking on things, hovering on things, to really go deep and simulate that stuff. And then obviously, of course, there's config it can grab so it can get things like a demo login and try that out. Including stuff like going and putting in a file, looking for the files that it's getting, going a little bit deeper. So now let's get into this monitoring for visual regression. So, we sort of talked around a little bit, but there are some really obvious use cases for doing this on a cadence, right? And if you're just joining, congratulations, you joined for the visual regression part. We were just talking about Checkly testing and monitoring as a concept in Playwright, but now look, we're diving into the meat of it. But talk a little bit about sort of one of the most clear, or some of the clear use cases for, hey, we want to be checking this visually with some regularity.
Where to start? Very good one. One of the most obvious ones, some that we do ourselves, because of course we dog food Checkly at Checkly. We check our homepage. Very simple. Our homepage actually does a couple of funky things. There's some animations going on. There's a cookie banner that pops up, of course. And I will show you later how we actually tackle that and how Playwright helps there. But we do that because we do have some third-party dependencies. We do have a CMS also backing the system. Things can change, and we kind of don't want that.
Yeah.
And things can change not because of, I don't know, something broke. There could be, an honest mistake. Someone clicks the wrong button in the CMS. How will you ever know? So this is an easy way to do it. We can go much further than that, by the way. You can really go into dynamic parts of the page. We'll show you later how that works, where you kind of don't want to check the dynamic parts, but only the static parts. What folks also do, which is really interesting, and I've seen that, is that they can actually use visual regression testing on component libraries. To be honest, we don't do that ourselves, but that's actually a really good use case. This is a static way. It's very specific UI component should look like this. You can make a snapshot of it and make sure that it's the same deploy after deploy.
Yeah, and CMSs is one big one they mentioned, right? Is that if you have some databases, sort of my standard little screenshot for this involves, oh, we swapped out a resource in the CMS or God knows why, and that of course is not a deploy, right? It's not maybe listed as a deploy, so just running post deploy checks is not going to cover this. But yeah, and then third-party dependencies, also things like Google Tag Manager and other things that can arbitrarily change a little bit of script in the page, and result of these changes that are a big concern, but we really don't have a nice predictable time. Hey, here's the time to check for those changes.
That is totally true. What you also see with, let's say, ad heavy websites is that third-party ads can sometimes break workflows. You've probably been on websites where you're trying to get, I don't know, to a review or some function, and there's this interstitial that literally blocks the thing that your customers want to do. That's pretty bad. And there's, again, nothing technically broke. And there's no easy way to kind of test that out, either in CI/CD or locally. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the interesting, anytime I have a conversation about this kind of in-depth automated monitoring, there's always somebody on Reddit or wherever who says, well, this shouldn't happen because you should have this process and that should prevent those surprises. And my question is always, is that how it works where you work? And it's like, well, no, we do get surprised, but it shouldn't be, because you should have these really clear contracts. And then I'll ask, has it ever been that way? Any place you've ever worked? And it's like, well, also no. But as we dive into the demo, we're going to see some of the ways that I think, as some of us are thinking about, oh my God, we have these ad modals, these other things. Does that make visual regression testing impossible? No, it does not. So we're going to see some of that sophistication in Tim's demo here in just a sec. Prerequisites, great. We'll dive into that just as an afternote. Why don't we go ahead and let you take the stage?
Sure.
The screen sharing stage. Do I have
Yeah.
to stop screen sharing? I think I do.
Yeah. You have to allow me also to share my screen. There we go. And I'm just gonna pop open my browser, folks, because what I want to show you is basically the 1, 2, 3 of how you can get started with visual regression testing. This is my demo Checkly account. It's called Acme Production. There's a whole bunch of other checks running, but I made a little group here with 2 checks. And what I'm going to do is first show you how to build one of these checks. And I'm going to start with the failing one because it's actually the most interesting one. Let me just pop open our editor. You can actually create a browser check by just going to the plus and you click on browser check because that's where it starts. The visual regression testing is not its own check type. It's essentially an extension of what you can do with Playwright, and our browser checks are essentially built on Playwright. So
yeah, this is a confusion I've heard a couple of times from people is you click browser check and it gives you a bunch of options. That's really just saying, hey, do you want me to insert a snippet of code for you? Because a browser check covers anything you need to do that requires
exactly.
browser rendering.
We actually do have some templates already there. Right here, if you're interested in that, does a visual regression test for you. But this one is pretty simple, and I wanted to show you kind of more of the how do you say, some of the tricks that you should know. So let me go into the one that I prepared. Looks the same screen. And what we're doing here is fairly simple. As you can see in this code, maybe I can actually make it a little bit bigger. Here we go. What we're doing is we're writing a test case with Playwright. And we're going to a website and we're doing an assertion with the expect statement. You might recognize this URL. This is the Hacker News website. And I took this website on purpose because it changes all the time. For those who don't know what that is, let me just pop it open right here. It's basically a forum, and the list of stories there change by the second almost. Probably if I reload it, so small changes are constantly happening. So
yeah, at least the vote numbers are changing probably on every single
exactly, but
reload.
also the order as folks upvote and downvote threads. So that's actually kind of tricky. How would I visually retest that? This check has already run a couple of times, and you notice that it was red. It's not working. But let's pop open our golden file. So what happens if I run this check? I can run it right now. We're going to pretend like it hasn't run before. There's a special button here all the way at the bottom. It says run script. And if you click open the context menu, you can run script and update golden files. That is the thing that will make the magic happen. You do that together with this very specific to have screenshot function that you call. So in natural language, go to the Hacker News website and expect the page to have a screenshot called, in this case, hackernews.png. You can call it whatever you want, it doesn't matter. We just snapped a screenshot, pretty cool. And it will show up as your golden file. This is what's in the name. It's the golden file. This is the one that we're going to check. You can see there's a specific order of these threads, right? Well, I think you get it. We also have a comparison thing here, right? But that's actually going to come in later. So remember that. So I made the check, 2 lines of code, super simple. I'm not going to save it because I want to show you what happens when this breaks. Because if I don't do anything now, this will be the result. In maybe a minute, maybe 2 minutes, if I run it, you're going to see this. It broke. And it broke because of a very good reason. Well, let me actually pop this one open. This was from a couple of hours ago. Screenshot comparison failed. So if you would hook this up to one of our alerting channels, which I can show you later, which could be Slack, email, anything that we have, a whole range there, you would get an alert and with a link to this page, and it would say, no good. But what actually changed? Well, there's a very funky feature that we have here, which is the snapshot diff viewer. This comes out of the box with Playwright, and we just have it in the cloud. The diff
this pixel by pixel view is not, it sort of gives you the general idea of what the problem is.
But what is really cool is that this is the golden image that we snapped earlier. This is the expected, like it needs to look like this. This is what we expect. And then actually what happens is this. And you can see that we can slide over what the changes are, which is the actual image that the check captured. So this is pretty cool. We can see the threads on this page flipping, and that causes this visual drift. So, okay.
Yeah, the diff view is especially nice if like something subtle change, like about text, like text spacing or something. That diff view is very, very nice to just highlight that in red.
Yeah, it's very cool. I mean, this looks kind of psychedelic, but this one's more definitely more useful. But then you might ask, like, okay, we can take this example and kind of translate it to, I don't know, an e-commerce page where product listings change, anything that has dynamic data. You can even imagine websites where there's something like locality, right? If you're an English, coming from an English-speaking country, you see this. If you come from a French-speaking country, you see that. So how do you make this work? Well, luckily I prepped that, of course, earlier, and that's this one. And I'm gonna pop that open right here again, because what we're doing here is two things. We are using Playwright's mask feature, which essentially looks like this. And I can go back to my golden file and I can pop it open. And this is Playwright's way of telling us these elements are masked out. I don't care about them. What we did is just look at the HTML of, in this case, the Hacker News website, and we found that all of these rows have a specific class, and we can put them in what's called a page locator and say, okay, block them out. What is interesting while I was doing this is that the layout or the height of these rows is actually not pixel perfect on each run. So I got an extra error. And I was scratching my head, like, how can I be a little bit more lenient, that it doesn't have to be like one pixel perfect?
Yeah.
There's something else that the Playwright visual testing gives you. It's max div pixel ratio. Picked a fairly low value, like it's okay if it drifts by a tiny, tiny bit. So this works really well. And you might have seen that on the screenshot and on the Hacker News page, there's actually one thing that is completely stable. That is the top navigation bar. So we can also actually just snapshot that and make sure that that never changes, because we can have multiple to-have screenshot functions in one page. So you can chop it up. And as you can see, this is just a second golden image that we have. And this way you can kind of carve out very specific things on your page to make them, to test them if they don't regress visually.
And this was an ability I actually didn't realize we had. I just saw it in rehearsal, which is very cool. And I'll mention, like, you can also, we don't cover it here, but you can do things like a hover or a click, obviously, but like a hover. So for example, if you have a drop down of recent items, you could take a screenshot of that element only after that hover or other in-page activity.
Yeah, just to hook into that, Nika, what I'm showing you here is just the bare basics, right? Playwright gives you all these interaction options, and there's no reason why we can't first navigate to a specific page and then call this to-have screenshot function. Or for instance, even with a cookie banner, you could script it that you just accept the cookie banner, it goes away, and then do your to-have screenshot. There's multiple options there.
Yeah. This is just kind of emphasizing the flexibility of Playwright, is that there are, as we might say in the US, many ways to skin a cat, right? When you realize, oh, this is not quite matching, but I do want to run this check on a cadence. There's a number of ways to do it. I realized that one of the things you could use was request interception, right? If you wanted to say, well, just give a standard response every time, you could say, well, let me go ahead and give just a default list for this. But obviously masking is a nice visual way, because you can see it on the golden file, like, hey, this is the stuff that's masked.
Correct. So yeah, that's kind of how it works in the UI. We probably also want to show how that works in a CI/CD workflow, or not, Nika? I can't hear your mic, Mika. I think your sound is turned off.
Apologize. There we go. I was chatting, so I don't want everyone to hear the mechanical keyboard. I just want to show this slide on some config to just be aware of. Masking is probably the very powerful tool for controlling what parts of the UI you show. But then think about these as, especially if you're doing things like little changes in palette or such, you might want to think about the color threshold and the number of pixels that are changed. This especially matters as we talk about, I think my next slide is golden files. One of the things to just be aware of, nope, One of the things to be aware of is just thinking about, hey, you may be using different rendering engines, or you may be changing some settings, and so that may cause colors to shift very slightly or pixels to shift very slightly, and so you want to use these to be a little more generous.
Yes, and I can from experience, typically with CSS and HTML, you're pretty safe, but once you start going into Canvas or, popping open PDFs, which all work, things can get a little bit more hairy there. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, let's talk about running this from the CLI, and then we'll get into
Sure.
this the whole concept of like running a visual regression test locally and feeding it a golden file, which is stuff we can do but maybe shouldn't do.
Yes. So I'm going to quickly go back to my browser, right? So this looks great. You can do that in the browser. You save it, it runs. But what if you want to, I don't know, have 25 of these or 30? It gets a little bit, messy because in the end it's code, and code needs to live in source control. And you might want to work together with your coworkers, maybe through GitHub, do some PR, stuff like that. We support that. We call that monitoring as code, and it's powered by our CLI. And probably the easiest way to get started is essentially go to the check that you just made in the UI, click export the code, and what you'll see is that we render a bunch of files that you can copy and paste. In this case, there's two files, one that just has exactly the code that we just saw, and this is kind of our check construct that puts in all the things that you need to run it as a check, like how often does it run, does it have a tag, does it have a should it send an alert when something breaks? You can download them or copy and paste them, super easy. So I, of course, already did that. So let me pop open my VS Code.
As Tim's popping that up, I want to. Jeff asked a great question about. Well, first of all, will the recording be available? Yes, it will. You should get an email from Zoom with a recording link, but I will also be sharing it on YouTube later in the week, and that'll just go up on the Checkly YouTube channel. I will try to get attendees an email as well when that's available on the YouTube. But then further asks about, hey, I want to kind of democratize this testing. Really good question about like, we got a technical manager, they want to create their own checks. Well, they can't use the web interface to enter, Playwright code. They can use this monitoring as code. There is also like a test generator that you can use to like record your clicks and have it feed out Playwright code and then drop it in. So I'm dropping a link to that in the chat. But yeah, tangent, but I wanted to know that was available.
No, exactly. The using Playwright Test Code Gen, which is kind of the official name of this auto record feature, is amazing. It works extremely well, and you can copy and paste the code, and off you go. We specifically did not build one ourselves because the one that comes with Playwright is really cool. So, but how do I make this happen from my code base? Well, I just mentioned you can copy and paste the actual code that you have in the UI. And what you would then do is create a Checkly project. Very easy to get started. The only thing you need to do is go into any project or code project that you have. We tend to advise people to store this right next to their application code, just like a test. You don't specifically need to, but it just makes sense, right? Because you can then, place any monitors next to, let's say, a folder that holds a specific part of code for a specific feature in your application or your web app. You get started with npm create checkly, and we'll give you a wizard and it'll log you in, even make an account for you, and give you some boilerplate. I already did that here, and you will end up with one file. You just need this one file. It's the checkly config ts. It just sets some defaults. I rarely change them when spinning up a new project. I just change the name, in this case, visual regression testing webinar. So what do we do now? Well, I have a folder called underscore checks. And as mentioned, I just copy pasted our Hacker News example. It's exactly the same. And let me actually remove these two folders, because we're just going to pretend we just spun it up. It's completely brand new. Nothing different here. Same code. Okay. So every command I'm doing here on the terminal, which I hope you can see, You can do that locally, totally fine. But we would advise putting that into your CI/CD pipeline. We have documentation for GitHub Actions, GitLab, CI, Jenkins, and general documentation, how it could essentially fit into any CI/CD pipeline, because in the end, we're just running command line options. So npx checkly test is your friend. And first, let's list which tests we have, because I made another one. Here's our Hacker News homepage, but I also made a Checkly homepage one, which I'm going to show you a little bit later. Now, what we need to do to run these is just execute npx checkly test. What happens? We bundle up all the code, send them off to the Checkly cloud, run them on our infrastructure, and report you back the outcomes, whether they passed or failed. But because we are doing a visual regression test, I need to pass in this flag, update snapshots. This is exactly the same thing as that little extra context menu we had on the run check button, but just as a command line flag. So let's just do exactly that. Off we go.
And while that's running, I'll just mention, I kind of touched on this previously, but one of the really powerful things I think about this CLI interface is that Playwright lets you run checks from your own machine. So, it's great to use the Playwright command to say, okay, go and check this API response, then say, okay, now run it through the actual Checkly system, which is lovely because you can do things like configure it to check from different geographies. So instead of having to sit there and hop on different VPNs to check, if this is loading correctly in Italy or doing these pop-ups, you can say, okay, I'll run it through the Checkly system. A limitation, which is not really a technical limitation so much as just sort of that's just the way it is that running a visual regression test locally, right? You can do that. You can create a golden file and you can compare it. But while that works great for a text-based check for saying, hey, I'll just save an API response to a text file, say, hey, go ahead and compare these two. Remember that for visual regression testing, we're using the same Chromium browser. Well, there's just many a slip twixt cup and lip there, right? So if you run it on the Checkly system, no matter how many times you run that screenshot, we are not going to change the rendering engine on you. So we will run it consistently and the screenshots will match. But if you run it on your own machine, on your own headless browser, and then try to run it someplace else, do a few updates to your machine, have your Mac update overnight, and you may discover, oh, now suddenly these screenshots don't match. So fine to do for a test run, but just worth considering that may break your flow just a little bit.
Yeah, you will notice it quite often with fonts and font sets. Somehow these are always a little bit different, whether you're on specific flavors of, in this case, I'm running on Mac OS or on Linux, and that will show up. What I just did, by the way, Nika, is I ran it again because I forgot an extra flag, which is the -- record flag. Because if I do that, I get a little link that was just reported back to me. Two things to notice here. I ran these two checks and these two folders appeared. You can see that on the left side of the screen in my Explorer, which is exactly what Playwright would write to disk. And here, actually, I'm not going to spoil that one. This is our familiar one, right? Hey, it's our Hacker News page, and this is one we also remember from the UI. Exactly the same thing. What happened in the background is that we moved these checks from these images from your local disk to our cloud. And you will see what happens if I click on this link, which of course you guys can't see because I'm sharing my Visual Studio Code. Here we go. I opened that link. What just happened is that I recorded a test session. And this kind of goes back to how we think about marrying the worlds of end-to-end testing to monitoring. Test sessions are their own thing. They're using the same code, they're using the same descriptions, they're using exactly the same things that you would later use for monitoring. We just run them once and record them as a test session. So let's have a look here. Here's our Hacker News visual testing, and whoop, looks exactly the same. Great. So that is how this works in conjunction with the CLI. So let's go back to the code window. Please,
it's funny, right as I was learning the CLI, I was like, oh, right, I have to remember to hit record every time to actually say I want it to show up in the interface. And then I remember actually like being part of a large testing framework and people getting alerts when tests failed and stuff. And the fact that I could not have a record flag and say, okay, do these changes I made to the test, do they
Yes.
work? And I could run it myself as many times I wanted. I could use the whole network of locations and then say, okay, now I want to actually record it. Now I want to actually send it to the UI and have it show up in the history of tests. Very,
That
very
is
nice.
That's exactly the reason why we built this and made that separate stage, right? Where once you're ready for it to show to the world, you hit dash dash record. So I would, for instance, do this on CI. So you can, your workflow could look like, hey, I'm just gonna run this all the time. I'm not gonna use the record flag, but I might want to use, let's say, the verbose flag to get a little bit more output. Because, we're all human, tests that we write are not always perfect. We need to do a couple of iterations. And once you're happy with it, you push it to your, whatever we're using GitHub Actions. And that's when you would hit that report flag. I just ran them again. You can see you get some more output, job logs, stuff like that. It should look familiar if you just paid attention to what you saw, what we just showed in the web UI. Now you want to turn this into monitors. We just did a test session, great, but that's not running around the clock. There's only one thing you need to do. Instead of the checkly test command, you hit the checkly deploy command. And what happens? We're parsing your project. It will ask you like, hey, do you want to actually deploy this to my account, which I'm logged into, and I will say yes, and poof, we're done. That took half a second, something like that. Now, if I would go back to the web UI, you will see those checks show up there. I'm going to show that later because I want to actually give you one more cool option that I was doing earlier.
That does speak to Jeff's question though about like a hybrid approach, right? You're able to have people who are using the web UI and people who are using the CLI and the code base working sort of in harmony, right? They're not having to like have conflicting updates or the old AWS thing of I keep having to highlight all my code in my editor and then just paste it into some web UI.
No,
No
no,
thanks.
no, 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 that is bad. Let's
Yeah.
not duplicate our code. One question that comes up quite often is, okay, a visual regression test failed. Who should I ping? Which team? Is that an engineer on call that then, sets off all the alarm bells? I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it's not ultra critical like a P1, but definitely someone should look at it. So this is where we can hook up an alert channel to a check. That's why I just wanted to show this one. I made another check. This one's going to our own homepage, as you can see here. Two cool things that we're doing. First of all, we're doing full page true. So it's going to create a snapshot of the whole page. And in this case, it's going to do that based on the device sizes and tolerances of an iPhone 12 mini, because I have an iPhone 12 mini right here. What that snapshot looks like is, well, you can imagine it's pretty long. This is our whole website rendered on an iPhone in portrait mode.
This is another flag. It is actually in the Playwright documentation, but I had not seen it as this thing that you can do the whole page grab, which is very, very nice. Actually, I realized I was worried about footer changes at one point and didn't realize I could do this. Very, very useful.
Also, one very interesting thing, if you would go to the Checkly website, these little lines here that are coming out of our mascot are animated. There's things flying there. What Playwright does for you automatically is disable these animations because you probably don't want to test for those. You can actually turn that back on if you want to, but the default is off, so it's pretty smart. But now let's say Nika goes to our CMS, screws up an image, and everything's upside down. What happens? Well, we probably should be aware of that. So what we do is we have alert channels for this. Should it go to, in this case, our kind of pager duty system that we have to wake up the engineers in the middle of the night? Maybe not, but I want to know. So let's create a Slack channel for it, which could go to, I don't know, our marketing department or design department. We allow you to do that in the UI. I'm going to show you that, but also just in code. In this case, by the way, this link is fake, so nothing in this case. Oops, let's call that marketing, for instance. And what I can do, and this is for the folks familiar with TypeScript, which I'm writing here, I just export this. And then in the check construct that I just created, I import it, it's called my Slack channel, and then I add it to my alert channels array. I can have multiple there, I just have one here. Short note here, this is our browser check construct, is what I mentioned earlier. It adds all the metadata and configuration that we add on top of a Playwright script. The name, whether it's activated, a couple of tags to organize stuff, how often it should run, in this case every hour, and then do we want to do any retries if it fails? In this case, just for demo purposes, I didn't want to do any retries. And then it points to the little spec file that we have here. This way, we're keeping the checks that you write, the code, completely in line with a Playwright test. There's no added stuff from Checkly. So I just hit deploy. You just saw me do that. Let me flip to my browser and show you what that looks like.
Oh, I think, Tim, we got your video frozen one more time. I don't know if that's for everybody or if it's just for me. Nobody else mentioned it, so. But there you go. You're back to full animation.
I'm back. Great.
Your animations are no longer disabled.
So what we have here is the checks I just deployed. Check the homepage. Cool, it's running. It already ran once. Great. What does that look like? Sorry, we'll kind of add a check. That's a golden file. Yeah, you recognize it. It's a very, very long one. But more importantly, it will reflect what we just did here, right? It will alert Slack. If I go to my settings, boom, there we go. So if this one fails, it's still going to ops. I just changed it into marketing, so I actually had to deploy it again, but I guess you understand what's happening here. This is how you turn your testing check into a monitoring check and maybe alert specific people in your organization when something breaks. That's kind of it, Nika. Anything else we should discuss?
Is that all? I mean, this is a good chunk of stuff. I'm gonna switch back to my presentation. There'll be a couple of slides that are we just saw that, or we saw that demonstrated, but more power to us. We'll zip through those. But yeah, disabling animations, right? This is the line to do this. This is off by default, which makes some sense, right? These days we have a lot of little active CSS animations pretty frequently. And then, yeah, right, masking, right, where we can pass this array of locators that we want to mask, and we get this really nice preview of that, which is very, very pleasant. Yeah, and then I think we talked to death this golden files thing. I think for me, sometimes the syntax right around a screenshot comparison is a little, it's not quite as natural as some of the other language around Playwright, and that's because it's doing a file compare, right? And so that's a little bit different than you might expect, like take screenshot. And one thing, I actually don't even have it in here, but I did just want to say, one of the questions that I think people might ask is, we have a Q&A question here. I'll answer that Q&A in just a second, but I just want to say that well, what about saying, well, just take a screenshot? I just want a screenshot. I want a screenshot because I want a screenshot about a check. That a really great place to see that is in the trace view of any run check that you've done, right? You can get screenshots of every stage of loading, right, from that. So Q&A question, is it possible to run visual regression tests on Checkly infrastructure without having them deployed into the Checkly account? Yes, that was that record command, a flag. If you don't pass that, it will run the check, it will use the infrastructure, but it will not say that there was a failing check on that check, or will not record it. Like e.g. accessor over cell environments for each PR automatically on each commit into the PR. So yeah, so you could say, hey, every time you run this, run a check, don't record it, take the output from it, parse the output, and then do something based on that output, for example. Yeah.
Or even more, Nika, there's 3 stages. You can also just use record, and then they don't run on a schedule. So if you just leave out the deploy, you won't be using any monitoring. You will just be testing. It's kind of up to you. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, without a deploy flag, right? You're not changing the test that's there in the UI. And then the last thing would be, this is not what you asked for, but it is another way to kind of, as we say in many ways, to skin a cat, is you could be changing the test spec on what your notification settings are on that. So it says, hey, just run this, store the output in the UI or don't, because maybe that's interesting to look at. Hey, we had a bunch of failures on deploy. We'll use that for our DORA metrics or something. But no notifications, please. We're going to use another system, right, to parse that output and inform ourselves another way. Add the reply to our the PR on GitHub or something like that. But no, please don't wake anybody up with this, because that's not what we want when someone like proposes a new branch. Okay. So yeah, golden files, update snapshots, mobile devices. One note about the mobile device, or two notes. One, when you define a device, that creates a viewport. So make sure to do your viewport second. Want to make sure there's nothing in chat. So you want to make sure that you set your viewport after you destructure the devices array. And then right now that only supports the Chromium and Chrome browsers. I think that's a Playwright limitation, but I could be wrong there. But yeah.
Sorry, Anika. This is on Checkly. We just support Chrome and Chromium right now. This is correct.
And the big advantage there is consistency, right? Is that you're not just grabbing whatever's available on the image or something. We have a very, very fixed thing, and that's really going to be very nice for your visual regression testing.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to just dip into other Checkly big ideas, because I said we'd take less than an hour, but oh boy, we had a little bit to talk about. And we had some good questions. Much appreciated, folks. Thank you so much to our attendees. Visual regression testing is not a great stand-in for accessibility testing, e.g., I want to make sure the text is the right size, and I'll check that this way. What an accessible browser is seeing is going to be quite different than your visual render. Obviously, we talk about screen readers and stuff. That's not a great model, but good news. The most recent Checkly runtime includes support for the Axe accessibility testing framework. We have a whole blog post about this. We have a video demo about this available from our great DevRel person, Stefan. And so this kind of steps through doing one of those checks. It's a very, very powerful tool. It's really worth checking out. You do not have to pass an accessibility test for this to work and be useful to you. You can say, hey, do we have new problems? Do we have more than we previously had? Do we have an error budget here, right? You can do all the kind of thresholding things that you do with a normal check. So that's available on the Checkly blog. If you're watching this on YouTube, that'll be linked down below, as well as a couple of the other documentation things we mentioned. And yeah, this general thing is monitoring as code. The one thing we kind of didn't dive all the way into, we talked about kind of a mixed model using the web UI, using the CLI. We talked about integrating with CI/CD, kind of touched on that. One of the things to think about as well is, we've seen all this config that you can make for a check to talk about notifications and frequencies and stuff, and manage that as part of your code. Very, very nice, because we have been in this situation at large orgs, at least as I have, of, hey, who set this thing to only every 24 hours, right? How'd that happen, right? If you're managing this stuff as code, you're able to much more clearly see where those changes happened, and maybe some commentary as to why, which gives us the other thing is that you can use source control, right? So we had this great question in the Checkly community Slack where someone said, well, I can deploy, and that's really nice, but what about when my coworker deploys at the same time and erases my checks, and we're kind of getting to that stage? It's like, okay, well, that's the time to start thinking about managing all this stuff in source control and saying, hey, I don't just want to deploy straight to Checkly. I want to go ahead and push this to a repository. And then, once our changes have been merged, then deploy over to Checkly. So if you want to get into that, there's a masterclass available on that, monitoring as code, with our own Jonathan and with Chris Cooney from the CoreLogix team. That is what I want to cover. Is there anything that you wanted to make sure we mentioned, Tim, before we sign off?
Well, it kind of covers it, Anika. I think, first of all, if any of this is confusing, or you want to chat to us, please, we show up on our Slack community. I hang out there, our developers hang out there. And in many cases, I could show you code examples of how we do this ourselves, because we're using our own monitoring all the time ourselves, and we can help you out there. So let us know.
Our Slack's a great place to get answers. You will get all of the Checkly experts will be there, including some of our users. But yeah, really fantastic. Folks, thank you so much for taking the time. I want to make sure we don't have any questions in chat. I will keep the webinar just open for a few more minutes in case anyone wants to drop any final questions in the chat, but I will close things up now. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, recording will be available within the week we'll see you go up on our Checkly YouTube, where you can find accessibility walkthrough, visual regression testing walkthrough, and other stuff in kind of nice, tight 3 to 5 minute demos.